Hi, KIB parents. Welcome to week 5 in the Maximize Mental Health Care webinar series. Today, we are focusing on strong connections and how you can listen, validate, and respond to your children's feelings and emotions. A reminder of the 8-week webinar series, and of course, today we are looking at strong connections. So, getting straight into the introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Firstly, what is listening and how to actively listen to your child or children? Secondly, what is validating and how to validate your children or child's emotions and feelings? And thirdly, what is responding and how to actually thoughtfully respond to your child or children when they are in moments of distress. So here is an outline as I've just spoken to. So starting with an overview, I want to share some statistics with you to give you a sense of where children currently go when they are feeling distressed. So as you can see here, the ways that younger versus older teenagers deal with personal or emotional problems are that those in year 7 to 9 tend to speak to someone more so than actually the older girls in years 10 to 12 who tend to more deal with it on their own. So about 1 in 3 will deal with it in their own if they're younger, and if they're older, 1 in 2 will deal with it on their own. Teenage girls particularly also have different ways of handling problems depending on their level of distress. So regardless of what age they are, if they've got a low amount of distress, teenage girls will typically speak to someone. So they'll reach out, which is great. That said, there is, of course, as you can see, a third who also will try and deal with it on their own. If they have a moderate level of distress, it's about half-half that they'll either deal with it on their own or speak to someone. And if they have high or very high levels of distress, they are much more likely, twice as likely almost, to deal with it on their own. This is obviously quite concerning given that the increasing level of distress means that they're increasingly likely to deal with it on their own. So particularly the more senior girls, so 14 to 17-year-olds who have a high level of distress or a very high level of distress, they're the least likely to speak to someone about their personal and emotional problems. This, of course, is quite concerning. We've looked already at last week at what are the warning signs. Sorry, 2 weeks ago, what are the warning signs that you can start looking out for? But what happens if you can't get through to children and they're not sharing those concerns with you, which is unfortunately the reality that most will not on average. So where are children going for sources of information, and including things like getting support for personal and emotional problems? This actually came from a webinar that KRB hosted a few years ago on sexual consent from Elephant Ed, and they found that young people tend to firstly go to the internet, which of course is not very surprising in this day and age. Then they would go to their friends for sources of information and support, then the school, and then finally, unfortunately, you as parents. So even more concerningly, of course, is that you're arguably one of the last to know if there's something going on, which is why we have looked at how you can help spot these challenges that might be happening. And today we're going to look specifically at how you can communicate with them and engage them so that you can talk to them about any problems that they may have before they escalate. So how do you connect with your teenagers? I would think it's probably fair to say that teenagers are notoriously believed to be tricky to communicate with. There's more likely to shut you out, particularly girls. We've looked at that moody and irritability and make it that they have to deal with problems themselves. We've just learned. So how do you as parents really deal with and connect with teenagers? As mentioned, I'm a child psychologist and work a lot with teenagers, and it does take perseverance with them sometimes, and that's the reward that you get. But also what I want to do today is really share some of the things that I use and the tools and to help you. What we're going to look at, particularly as we've mentioned already, 3 things: listen to them and how to do that, validate what they're saying and what does that mean, and then respond. And I'm going to give you pretty structured ways to do that to help you. Why? The benefits obviously are, as we've just looked at, to help talk about issues and problems that they're dealing with before they escalate and help them when they're feeling that high emotional distress. It also helps you to build the trust and emotional connection with them. Helps foster more general open communication, which is great as well, beyond just them sharing their mental challenges or concerns. Supports their own emotional well-being and health, encourages their own collaboration and problem solving, enhanced emotional regulation and resilience to help them be able to develop those skills early, and that EQ is really, really beneficial. Stronger interpersonal skills and empathy that you get to learn, and also greater emotional intelligence and understanding of not only your children, but also others. So to start with, what is listening? So this goes back to a Greek philosopher, Epictetus, who said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. I think that's a good way to first look at listening, is something we should definitely be doing twice as much as we are talking. Carl Rogers, a very prominent psychologist, said active listening is that he hears the words, the thoughts, the feeling tones, the personal meaning, even the meaning that is below the conscious intent of the speaker. So it's definitely about going beneath that words, those verbal cues themselves and those things that they're saying, and actually looking at how they're saying it, but also what actually they're saying underneath just what they're communicating. 50 years later, we still think of active listening in the same way. It's a communication skill that goes beyond simply hearing the words that another person speaks, but also seeks to understand the meaning and intent. It's about being an active participant rather than passive in the communication process. So it's really about you being part of it, and it's a two-way street. This is an excellent book, which I love. She's a journalist, Kate Murphy, but it's also grounded in excellent psychological and scientific research, which I think is really important. And one of the things that she said is that listening is about giving descriptive and evaluative information. Again, as we just read, it's not about necessarily being passive. It's about replaying back with some sort of evaluation. Responding in a thoughtful, feeling way, and understanding the intent and meaning beneath the words. So as you can see, it's in all instances, listening is really about hearing meaning beneath words. We've looked at this before, and this is something that we as psychologists look to unpack. What are those underlying feelings? And I want to give you some obviously skills to help you do that. So you're attending obviously in the first instance to what they do and say, and help infer what they're thinking and feeling. The skill, I think, of active listening, most importantly, are threefold, and you'll get the gist here, hopefully, which is you try to understand them even when they're not making much sense, particularly for teenagers and anyone that's going through an emotional challenge. They probably won't be making much sense, and there won't necessarily be that rationality there. And we looked at that previously, the irrationality or being out of touch with reality as potentially denoting mental illness. So the point here is you get them even if you don't understand why they're saying what they're saying. Similarly, you grasp their point of view even when it's against your own perspective. And that's very important because we're interested in their perspective fundamentally, and it may conflict with yours. Finally, you give them the ability of making their own decisions again, even when you think that it's not necessarily right. So, in all three instances, active listening may involve a conflict between what you know to be true, the best for them, to make sense, to have your perspective, and actually what they themselves believe, what they're trying to understand and communicate, their perspective, and their ability ultimately to make decisions. This is, I think, heightened in teenagers because they are going through that time where they are developing their own perspectives, worldviews, understanding, interpretations, and trying to start making their own decisions and increasing that independence. Just be aware that it might not always align with your own, which is okay. It's more about the skill itself with listening, despite these differences. So, how to listen? Well, obviously, listening implies, firstly, that we have to have someone talking. So, on the surface, this would be verbal communication and that actual talking that they would engage in a communication with you. How and what do we talk about with them? As we've looked at last week, start by focusing from a strengths-based positive psychology lens on what is positive and good. So, what are their strengths, interests, and values? And this is not only to build their own self confidence and esteem, but also to use these skills and interests as for building that resilience and emotional regulation skills that they can draw upon, particularly when they're feeling like their emotions are perhaps all consuming and beyond their control. So this is when you can really use these to also draw back into them. These sorts of things also help you to connect. Focusing on these things and drawing these out of them also helps you to connect to them. This makes you more human to them. So even though you are their parents and you've raised them and you've always set the path, it does make them see you more as a human and therefore an equal as well. It can help to gain respect from them. If you're demonstrating genuine interest in whatever it is that they're interested in at the moment, then that can help develop that sense of respect. It makes you ultimately more approachable to come to you when they do have a problem, which is exactly what we want to happen. And it makes you more relatable, as we said. So, what are you listening for? And as we said before, this may involve when they're actually talking, but of course, we're listening for and looking for not necessarily just verbal communication. So, there may be subtle verbal hints. So, they may say things like, there's, I can't do this anymore. I'm just really always tired. You're hearing for those themes of maybe being overwhelmed or feeling helpless. You're listening for, of course, direct communication and conversation. So when they are specifically directly expressing their feeling. So I'm feeling really sad, mum, or I'm just unhappy at the moment. Those sorts of things they may say. Digital communication is an excellent tool, particularly for teenagers. And to give you an example, I work with children all the way from 4 years old till well into their 20s. What I'm increasingly finding, although the oldest children are happy to have a FaceTime and see and hear me in a session, the younger they get, the more likely they are to either one, want to turn their camera off or do a phone conversation, or two, and increasingly younger children want to either text me or type responses to me via Zoom without a camera or even audio on. So they're increasingly using texting and typing as their preferred way to communicate. Now, arguably, most people say, well, isn't it better once you're face to face and in the room? Whatever's actually going to help your children communicate how they're feeling in whatever format that looks like, I think we go to them and we respond to their needs there rather than telling them how it should be. So that's a really interesting thing for you, I think, to know, is that it's not always going to be the face-to-face communication. It's going to be the written, potentially. They may feel more comfortable there. And then finally, indirect signals. So indirect signals may be that they are listening, for instance, to a lot of music that is concerning, if we're thinking about maybe depression, topics like death, dying, grief, loss. Um, Listening for their interests, again, can help you to spot those changes that happen or those themes that pop out. You may also find that there's themes in what they are now interested in or fixated on. So maybe a particular celebrity's mental health struggle and how they're really relating to that, and different TikToks that may be engaging them. So that's why it's really about getting across what their interests are and where they're focused on, to help use those almost as clues. What happens, of course, if there is no talking? And as mentioned, teenagers don't necessarily like to talk, and it's not necessarily verbal all the time. We've looked at this before, being hyper observant. Just want to remind you of that, because I think that's the best way to pick up those nuances and idiosyncrasies that you will be able to spot, which is either different to siblings at that same age, for instance, or their peers, or differences between who they were a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago to now, and being in tune with those sorts of changes. So how? Ultimately, it's okay if they don't talk necessarily, because the non-verbal, as we know, and how they say things is far more telling than the verbal and what they say. So tune into the non-verbal. That's most likely how they will be able to communicate as well their feelings and emotions in a very honest, unfiltered, authentic way. As mentioned, I wanted to teach you specific principles of how I and psychologists, how we work. Three key things are empathy, non-judgment, and rapport. And empathy, starting with, is very important in literally putting yourself in their shoes and not necessarily trying to imagine how you would feel in that situation, but thinking in light of their background, their interests, their strengths, their challenges at school, their friendship groups. From all of that and that perspective, that can really help you think about what are they going through themselves. Non-judgment is another principle that we are taught very early on, which is to have absolutely no judgment. And that means not putting our opinions and sharing opinions onto children. It's really letting them be fully able to express their own opinions, feelings, behaviours without having any sort of ramifications. So not taking your own opinion and putting it on them, really important. And finally, rapport. And rapport is something that can be developed when we have likeness. So for instance, knowing what their strengths and interests are and maybe how they're similar to yours, for example, and building that sense of just warmth and genuine kindness is very helpful. And how can you apply these similar sort of principles that we use as psychologists at home? So ultimately, it's about creating a safe environment where your children feel comfortable to share anything and everything with you, particularly concerning these emotions, feelings, and thoughts that they may be having. So how also can we do this? So creating warmth, which we mentioned before, to build that rapport and instill a psychologically safe environment, which means that they know they will not be reprimanded or made to feel judged or ashamed of different thoughts and feelings they may be having. So knowing that they're there for you, you're there to them to listen to. Encouraging stories. So for instance, saying to them, can you tell me how something made you feel when something else happened? So you're not necessarily probing particularly like, why were you so angry today? It's more, why don't you tell me from your perspective what was really happening? You know, if you've noticed something, and picking up on those non-verbal cues. Often when you encourage storytelling, children will naturally come out with their own version of what's happened and their takeaways, which is obviously very insightful. Asking why, and 5 times is the rule ultimately. Why we ask why, is because even when we think we might know the answer and how we would have attacked it or thought about something or made sense of a situation, it's important to understand from their perspective what was happening in the root cause almost of all of that. So, for instance, and this is also not to be in attacking interrogation mode, by the way. So, it would be saying variations of why. So, for instance, the school's called, how come, you're not doing your homework in most classes, for instance. They might get attacked, they might feel like they've been attacked and get defensive. And so they might just say, oh, well, it's just, I just don't want to do it. Not really interesting. It's like, oh, okay, well, why do you think that is? Why aren't you interested by it? I just don't forget. Like I forget what happens every week, and so I just don't want to do the homework. It's like, oh, okay, and so why you think something's happening with forgetting instead of the actual homework? And so you can sort of get to the stage where it's not necessarily that they're choosing not to hand in homework. They might be actually forgetting, and that can obviously pick up things like, for instance, that we've looked at, ADHD. It's more of forgetfulness rather than a deliberate choice not to do homework. Avoiding judgment, we've covered this. Don't correct or impose your own opinion. We're really interested in their perspective. That's where you're going to learn the most, and taking that growth mindset on. And finally, being fluid. So going sort of further to the stories, going where they find is interesting, and you'll uncover what they want to particularly share, which is not always what you originally had in mind. So it's much more conversational rather than scripted. Of course, there's the caveat on this, that if you do think they're in some sort of danger or harm, then having a script, which we will look at in week 8, which is how do you specifically escalate when you're really worried. But for the most part, it's about building that general rapport and strong relationship and connection with your children. So another way to help children talk, of course, is by not talking. So respecting silence. And I've put this up because I think this is applicable potentially for you as parents and business people. Japanese proverb is the silent man is the best to listen to. The American proverb is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So from those, you can sort of already see that Japanese respect silence to the point that Japanese business people tolerate a silence of 8 seconds compared to American business people who have been found to tolerate a silence of 4.6 seconds because they want to keep the conversation going. They don't want to have pauses. They want to chat, not necessarily stop and consider other perspectives. So the overall takeaway is, I think here, respect the silence, model what the Japanese do, who are also known for doing very human-centered methodologies that we use also in cognitive behavior therapy as well. Another way to encourage informal conversation, that fluidity that we talked about, is really consider informal moments. So it's not necessarily at all at the dinner table across from your child when you want to necessarily bring up, well, how did you feel when that happened today? Tell me what's going on now at school. It's actually using those moments outside when they're probably going to be more relaxed and you can chit chat about different things that you can help encourage conversation. And this was a tool that my mum was taught apparently years ago in another KIB psychological seminar from Michael Carr-Gregg, who is, of course, a great Australian psychologist. And this is what he talked about, was using actually the car specifically as that perfect time to have those conversations which may be more awkward or uncomfortable for children, because they also don't have to look across from you. And you can also focus on the driving and the radio and other things. So to summarize how to actually listen: fostering open communication, listen more, speak less, show empathy, avoid judgment, respect their privacy, so know that you also trust them, normalize mental health discussions and make that a topic of conversation, and finally, where necessary, and again we'll look at this in week 8, is encourage professional help. Moving on to what is validating and how is validation defined. This is the recognition or affirmation that a person or their feelings or opinions are valid or worthwhile. A few things to draw your attention to is that it's about you as parents recognizing and affirming your child's feelings and emotions and making them feel like they're legitimate. They are worthy. They are normal. Also want to draw you to the origin of validation. Back in the 17th century, it's the act of giving validity. And I've underlined giving here because this is really important as opposed to deciding of whether it's valid or not. As we've looked at already, it's not about judgment. It's not about whether you think something is or is not valid in terms of their feelings and emotions. We know that feelings and emotions are valid. You cannot dispute them. We can dispute what we do about those, but inherently it's very hard to change off the bat feelings and emotions, as you would probably know from your own personal experience, because they are automatic. So to summarize that, deciding validity is not your job in this case. It's not to determine whether they are valid or not, their opinions and thoughts. What it is, it's about giving validity. So it's recognizing that, oh, yes, I can see you're feeling sad here. Yes, okay, that makes sense. That's normal in this situation. So very different, making sure that you're not telling them whether that's legitimate or not, but actually giving them that ability to know that, yes, those feelings and thoughts are normal and justified. So similarly to how we looked at the skill of active listening, the skill of giving validity is that you're acknowledging their feelings even when they're not necessarily rational. As mentioned, not necessarily their actions. We can debate how they deal with those feelings and emotions, but feelings and emotions themselves, they are should be acknowledged. You recognize their feelings and emotions even when that's not how you might feel in those circumstances, because again, that's a key proponent of empathy, which is recognizing they have valid individual emotions and feelings based on their background and circumstances and experiences. Finally, you affirm their feelings and emotions even when they're not necessarily a typical reaction. This one can also indicate, obviously, the fact that there may be some unhealthy feelings and emotions going on, but in the first instance, it's about giving that validity to make sure that they know their feelings and emotions are affirmed and legitimate. The benefits of giving validity and validation to your children and their feelings and emotions is that it fundamentally promotes mental health and well-being. They are able to have that sense that they are valid in terms of what they're thinking and feeling, and it helps foster that self-compassion and self-acceptance of their own thoughts and feelings. It encourages them to also provide you with honest and authentic expressions, which is of course of what we want, given we know that girls, young girls particularly, do not come to you as parents, but do not necessarily reach out. So it helps to open up that dialogue. It therefore also encourages the collaboration and problem solving, because you're then part of the problem or part of the conversation now. It can help them to have personal growth and self-awareness, to recognize that, yes, this is what I'm feeling, and someone has validated that's actually what I'm feeling. It empowers them with their feelings and emotions and gives them a sense of ownership over them, and enhances ultimately their healthy emotional expression. So how do you as parents validate your children's feelings and emotions? And specifically, we're going to look at 3 particular techniques. You can validate by being reflective, empathetic, and affirming. We'll look now what each of these mean. You can validate by being reflective, which means you will repeat or rephrase your child's feelings to show that you understand and acknowledge their emotions. So for instance, if they said, I'm frustrated because I can't do this maths homework, you could reflect on that and say something like, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated by maths. Now, this seems like you're almost just parroting them, and in some ways you are. But what they will hear is their own words replayed back to them, which helps encourage that self-reflection and acknowledgement that you've been able to identify and hear them. You can also validate by being empathetic. So show empathy by recognizing and sharing in your child's emotions. And you can do this by looking at and responding with words, your tone of voice, body language. So not just the verbal cues, but also particularly non-verbal when we're talking about empathy. So for instance, you may understand that you can see that they're, for instance, upset, and you may infer that it's because something like they've always been left out of friends' parties on the weekend. You can go then and apply validation to their feelings by recognizing they're crying. So calling out the potential emotion they're feeling and saying something like, I can imagine that being left out would make you feel sad. So as you can see here, you won't always necessarily be told what they're feeling, but do make the inference. And if you're not 100% sure why they're sad or crying and you weren't privy to what was happening with the friends, then it can be empathizing and saying something like, I can see you're sad. Do you want to tell me what's going on? So it's just that open-ended question. And finally, you can validate by being affirming. And affirming means to offer support to your child to let them know that their emotions are normal. And that is really important in normalizing emotions and feelings so that they don't feel like they should be ashamed or they've done something wrong or they're inferior anyway. So for instance, if there is something going on at home between mum and dad or parents, I'm worried, they might say, I'm worried about what will happen with you and dad. The first instance to affirm or validate is saying, that's understandable, you are worried. That is important to again replay back to them the worried, the word that they can see and they've come up with and determine that's how they're feeling in this case. And telling them they're understandable means that that's a normal reaction. And of course, that would be something that they may be feeling at this moment, given the things that may be happening, for instance, at home. In this case, of course, though, you probably don't want them to feel worried about mum and dad or dad and dad and mum and mum, whatever's happening at home. You don't want them to necessarily worry about it, but it's still important to validate that in a first instance. But there may be times, for instance, what happens if their feelings are valid, and we now hopefully acknowledge that all feelings and emotions are valid, but objectively not healthy or beneficial for them. So for instance, in that last example, we don't want them to have to worry about what's happening at home and what's going to happen with parents. So that's how we get on to what is responding. Before we get into specifically what to do when you can have the foresight to know some behavior, some thoughts and feelings are not necessarily beneficial, we'll start by going through and looking at what is responding as a definition and how to actually do it. Always start with validation. That's really key. A key takeaway from this whole webinar is whenever children express anything to you related to their feelings, emotions, psyche, validate. And validate is by doing those three things we've just looked at in terms of being reflective, empathetic, and affirming. Then how do you further respond? Well, responding is giving a promise in return, a reply or answer. So the return bit I want to call out because it means that something has to have already come your way in the first place in order for you to return. Going back to Latin 14th century as well, re is back to the original place, and spondere is to pledge. So pledging something back to the original place in response to. The importance of this definition is back to the original place. Back to what original place? If your child's come to you, then they have come to you with a problem, and we want to actively listen to what they're saying. So we're actually going back to what they have said to you in the first place, which is why the active listening in the first instance is so important. So using that can help us to identify, well, what are they wanting you to respond to? What are their real needs, underlying needs? They may come to you with a question, for instance. So they may have a need that they want an answer to a question. They may also have a need that they just want to share, and they want to say something to you and let you know about what's going on and volunteer that. On the extreme end, their need may be that they're crying out for help and they need some urgent care. So in this instance, they may say something along the lines, or you may get the inference that they are saying, I need help. I don't know what to do here. Can you help me, please? You know, that more desperation. So once we've understood what they are needing, then we can respond accordingly. So the types of responding are saying something, which is of course a verbal response. So it's always offering validation in the first instance, asking more questions, seeking more clarification to understand more and develop that empathy so you do really acknowledge and understand their perspective. You may want to respond by gesturing, so the non-verbal responses. Even a concerned face, mimicking what they're doing with their body, nodding with them, showing them that you're accepting what they're saying and understanding what's happening from their worldview. It may be smiling, giving them that sort of facial cue of encouragement. It may be when they're coming to you with positive emotions and excitement about how they've done at school. It may be giving them a thumbs up. So that's also the responding. The third instance is typically a response after you've had an initial conversation with them, which is a response of doing. So for instance, that might be speaking to your partner about it and each other as parents. It may be speaking to a sibling if there's a problem or a relationship challenge there, or it may be speaking to the school if that's ultimately what's required. Important to note here is sometimes children do just want to vent. So we're not always here to solve a problem. And I think that's important to call out because children don't necessarily want to be fixed. And in fact, I'd say teenagers are more on this side of they want to try and prove that they can be independent, they're growing up and they're developing on their own without having to have parents always to come in and save the day and fix things. So just something to keep in mind, that they're expressing emotions, could also be venting. And the fact that they're coming to you in the first place is already an excellent indication that they have that psychologically safe environment and they are willing to communicate with you how they feel, which would be when you would encourage and thank them for sharing and acknowledge that just how brave that is in the first instance. So now that we know what is responding, how do you as parents respond when your children come to you with emotional problems and concerns? I want to draw you back to the book, You're Not Listening, and an excerpt that I'd like you to just read now on the screen, please. A few things to draw your attention to. If your child's saying something like, I hate it, I'm never going back, I quit. In the first instance, it's something to think about here. Are they venting, as we've just looked at, or are they really intending to quit? A couple of natural responses that we may have, and our normal way of responding may be doing something like grilling them. So for instance, what do you mean you hate it? What are you talking about? You're not going back? Are you really actually quitting? No, you're not doing that. What happens then is that's interrogating. They will naturally feel attacked, defensive. That may lead to them shutting the door, screaming, jumping out the car, and just shutting down the conversation altogether, which is then blocking potential for you to have that strong connection with them. Telling them they shouldn't feel how they feel. So, no, you shouldn't hate soccer. Everyone loves soccer. It's good for you. You can't quit. That's minimizing. It's not acknowledging their feelings and emotions on the topic, and it's undermining what they are at least trying to communicate to you. And changing the subject. For instance, oh, well, it's just a practice, don't worry, just wait for the game on the weekend, I'm sure you'll love it again, or focus on netball instead. That's just naturally infuriating, can cause more angst and madness. Kids, like all of us, just want to be heard. So it's about hearing them. Instead, try things such as, have you always felt this way? Or what would quitting mean? So what you're doing in those two instances is trying to help them to see the bigger picture, which is, have they always felt this way about soccer? And therefore, does it need to lead to quitting based on this particular soccer practice? Also, what would quitting mean? Helps them to self-manage their own decision-making skills, and gets them to really think about the consequences of their actions. Ultimately, regardless of whether they're venting and this is just a once off, there's obviously something else underlying happening. Use this as an invitation to have a conversation. That's the most important thing. If they're ever coming to you with something and confiding in you and giving you at least some sort of strong emotional reaction, use that as something to talk about, not necessarily something for you to fix yourself or get upset about. As we looked at before, you may think that actually they should continue to play soccer, they shouldn't quit because it's good for them and physical health is good for them, and it's also obviously good for their social skills. So what does happen if their feelings are valid, but objectively you don't see them as parents as being healthy or beneficial for them? And of course, you do have the benefit of the foresight, which they can't necessarily have. So then what? How do we respond in that situation so it is beneficial for them? If it's not clear enough by now, please note, always respond firstly with validation, and then you can always probe. So, for instance, starting with, it sounds like you're not enjoying soccer. At least they've heard that you've acknowledged what they've said and you've replayed it back to them to put it into words, because clearly there's a lot of emotion going on. So you're trying to help identify to them, okay, you're not obviously enjoying this right now. Then you can probe with those other examples we've just saw, which is, have you always felt this way, to help them with the perspective taking? What would quitting mean? And to help them take ownership of their own decisions. Other strategies for responding: offering support. So reminding them that you're always there to continue to talk about them and their issues. And this is something I would encourage in all instances. If they ever come to you with any emotionally charged particular reaction, then always have a follow-up. That tells them that you're caring, you're listening, and you're happy to set the time aside to talk about something that's obviously quite provoking to them in their emotions and feelings. Ask open-ended questions. As we've just seen, for instance, have you always felt this way? What would quitting mean? That's going to help them with their own curiosity and critical thinking to problem solve. Collaborate with them. Try and help them to overcome their challenge themselves, but also be there as a support if they need it. So them having this sort of reaction and giving you an insight into that is obviously an initial indication that they are wanting to get some assistance for somewhere or some sort of reassurance. Provide guidance. Resources can also help them to self-manage and direct them when they're feeling lost. So you can direct them to other things to look at, read, explore in their own time, which again promotes that self-autonomy and empowerment for them. And finally, and clearly we've said this a few times, but avoiding judgment. Not trying to correct or impose your opinion. We're just interested in their perspective. So even if we know in that first instance, it's probably not a good idea for them, just listen to them. They will most of the time get there on their own with the right questions and enough time to reconsider what are the different options. If and when that happens, then that the actions are not aligning with what they should be doing, then that's a different conversation. But at least in terms of their feelings and emotions, avoid judgment. It's quite a minefield. There's lots of things to think about and consider. So if you are ever unsure how to respond, here are a couple of go-to responses. Always start with thanking them for sharing. That helps them to feel heard and validated and empowered, that they've at least had the bravery to come to share a problem with you, which is, of course, what we want. So thank you. I'm glad you felt comfortable. Afterwards, after you've had at least an initial conversation, saying something like, how are you feeling now, can get them to check in and have that mindful moment of, oh, okay, I'm feeling actually a little bit better, and helps to reinforce to them, and that will positively reinforce to them that they should come back to you in future with their problems, because a problem shared, they say, is a problem halved. So no doubt, at least talking it through with you is already going to be reinforcing to them to come and see you again. In order to help them reflect and think about what they can do and what it's in their control and where they want to go to from here, you could say something like, what do you think you can do from here? If it is the case that you can see that they need just that extra bit of support, or you're wanting to help them even more, and you know that they can see, you can see that they probably it's not within their capability to solve all by themselves, you could say something like, I can see you're needing some help here. How do you think I can best help you? And finally, saying something like, can I think about the best way to go from here and come back to you, gives them the confidence that you care above and beyond just this once. You've got the time for them and you'll make the time. A couple of things to note on this page. Firstly, these are clearly quite scripted, but hopefully you get the gist of how this should work. So it's about acknowledging, validating, helping them to self-reflect, self-manage, and then intervening or offering your support when needed. Note that that's later on in the piece. That second thing to note is that you don't need to always respond immediately. And we learnt this very early on in psychology, which is, don't make someone else's urgency your own emergency. So you don't necessarily have to respond in the moment in a similar way to them, which is quite emotionally charged and fueled. And in fact, it's beneficial for both of you to say, okay, let's regroup and come back and think about it. So always know that it's okay not to have a response when we talk about responding. How would you respond to this situation? I would like you to think about this, and then we'll go through the particular steps that we would take. So your child said to you, I've got no friends at school. Everyone keeps leaving me out. I want to move schools. What would you do? I'll just give you 10 seconds. So immediately, you could do three things. Firstly is to validate their feelings and thank them for opening up to you. Note that this is first. Even though we talked about active listening at the start, they've already come to you with a quite an upset tone. They look upset, as you can see, so you're using those non-verbal cues as well. So in this case, you can validate that straight away. They've already given you at least enough. And then you would continue to listen as the second step, without judgment, and just to show them that you're caring and have the time and attention for them. Then finally, we can identify if the issue can be self-managed, either amongst themselves, you two collaboratively, or do you require external or outside help, and then proceed accordingly. So to go through what specifically these three steps could look like and sound like. Validate. That might sound something like, I'm sorry, feeling like you have no friends would understandably be very upsetting. In this instance, you're acknowledging that they're upset. You're also reminding them that's understandable, that's normal, that's that affirmation as part of the validation. And you're replaying back to them the no friends, you're parroting them with that language that they've used to show you've heard them. Other responses or phrases could sound like, being excluded never feels nice. Of course, that would make you sad. These are things that also encapsulate validation, which is that having that empathetic approach and that affirmative, and making sure that they know it's not just them that would find this upsetting, and knowing that it's it's a generally feeling excluded is never a nice feeling. Unhelpful statements, and these may be our natural reactions because we've heard move schools. So for instance, saying something like, move schools, you've got plenty of friends. Like, what are you talking about? The reason why they're unhelpful is because they're not validating and hearing their feelings and emotions of the child. They're already jumping to solution mode or whatever they've come up with as a solution. And you've got plenty of friends is minimizing the fact that, well, no, they're telling you they've got no friends. And to them, that's what it feels like right now. So they can't necessarily see that reaction, that what's actually happening in reality at this stage. And we can get to how to unpack that. Secondly, listen. This may sound something like, I'm here for you. Can you tell me more about what's been happening at school? When we talked about active listening earlier, we looked at the importance of hearing the underlying meaning. It's not just about the words. So even if your child's mentioned no friends, leaving school, it could be something to do with friends, which is causing them to want to leave school, but generally there's something happening at school. That's important to know that you can listen for, and you should be listening for what's below the surface and what's the underlying cause. Also, I'm here for you. You're reminding them that you're there, you're present, you want to create that safe environment for them. Other things you could say here would be, let's sit down and talk about this, so they really know that you have their undivided attention. They have your undivided attention and you're giving them that time and consideration, which is obviously going to help make them feel like they've been heard. And also entertaining the possibility that they've raised, and it's probably something you should at least acknowledge, which is, well, why do you think moving schools would help? And that is to get them to consider what, from their perspective, would be the benefits of moving. Reminded that it's not about your perspective and whether that's a good outcome or not. It's about hearing their perspective and their worldview as to why they've come up with that as the solution. We don't need to act on anything just right now. It's just about listening and understanding empathetically where their head's at. Unhelpful statements could be, I wanted to move schools at your own age too. The reason why this is unhelpful at this stage is because it's about them, remember, and not your experience and your worldview and your past encounters. That may be helpful to build commonality and them recognize that this is normal and this does happen at some stage, but immediately diving into your experience of wanting to leave school and how you ended up staying at the school and etc. is just not helpful now. That's not listening, that's talking. Another unhelpful statement might be, friends will always come and go. That is minimizing the fact that they've said, no, they've got no friends and they're wanting to leave school over this. And so to them, it's actually trivializing quite a big issue that they're facing and feeling right now, which is clearly provoking quite an emotional reaction. So that would be minimizing and undermining what they're trying to tell you. Thirdly, act. This is where we help to identify whether it can be self-managed either amongst themselves, you two collaboratively, or bringing in external forces. So a really general, open-ended question, which is very empowering, asking them is, where shall we go from here? So that gives them agency. It helps them to feel more in control, which, as we know, is good for mental well-being. Other things you could ask here, what do you think you can do about this? So quite more directly asking them, particularly what's in their control. How can I help you? Also then offering the support. Unhelpful statements are more of those statements rather than questions, which are, well, let me speak to the school about this. I'll deal with this basically, and I will book you in with a psychologist. In this instance, at this point, these would be considered unhelpful statements because they are not necessarily empowering your child to help problem solve themselves. That is limiting for a number of reasons. It does not help them with their own emotional regulation and decision making. It doesn't help them build their own resilience and grit. And it gives the impression that you will always be there to fix things and help them and solve things for them. It's not promoting growth mindset ultimately doesn't help them in the short term or the long term. In that last instance, I'll book you with a psychologist. As I said, that may not be suitable at this point in time. However, there are definitely times when I would recommend you act if you do think they need to see urgent professional help or start seeking it. In those instances, that would look like them being highly distressed. So you can see that they are upset not only at school with the friends, but that is starting to trickle at home and impacting their home life and weekends and holidays as well, for instance. As we've looked at before from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's what we call clinically significant distress. So it's happening across multiple domains. Another time to seek professional help is if their feelings and emotions are lasting at least 2 weeks. That is probably the minimum that we say that has to have denote a mental illness disorder. As we've looked at before, this can be longer for different disorders depending on time, but I would say look for at least 2 weeks. And lastly, and possibly most importantly, if there is any mention of suicide, suicidality, fixation on death or thoughts, or any evidence or indication that they may be self-harming, that is when I would urge you very strongly to seek professional help. We are going to look further at how to seek that extra support and help and learning when and how to escalate, particularly for you as KRB parents. What do you exactly do and how do you do that in week 8? And we'll go into that further. But as long as at this stage you are knowing that there's extra support available and where to find it, use those resources. And to summarise, what did you hopefully learn today? Listening involves understanding the meaning of what your child is saying beyond the words they share. Listen actively by attending to both the verbal and non-verbal cues, being hyper-observant, demonstrating empathy, non-judgment and rapport, but also creating a safe environment, respecting silence, and considering informal moments, such as driving in the car to school. Validating is recognizing and affirming your child's feelings and giving them credibility and legitimacy, even when they're not necessarily rational or typical reactions. Validation involves being reflective, which is about paraphrasing, empathetic, which is about recognizing and naming emotions, and affirming, so normalizing feelings. Finally, responding is returning, replying, or answering your child's needs, whatever they may be. Responding involves validating, listening, and taking action, which may involve seeking professional help. As always, I would ask you to complete a quick question for me, just so I know whether you have or have not gained any knowledge today, but also there is an option to submit some feedback and answer additional questions, which I can address in the subsequent webinar series. So I'll just give you 20 seconds to do that, please. Finally, resources, particularly in light of what we've spoken about today. If you do sense that your child is in distress for at least 2 weeks and there are thoughts of suicidality or self-harm, here are your emergency contacts. You also, as parents, have 3 months free subscription to Maximinds, where you will have tools that you can help to use with your children. And these are available for free for 3 months, and there's a link on the website for you to sign up. Here is the link to go to. There is a promo code KRB 2023, so please pop that in the quarterly subscription and you can sign up. And also here are my contact details if you would like to contact me, provide feedback, ask further questions, discuss any questions you may have regarding your child, or otherwise I'm available. So thank you, and I'll see you next week.